Pam Bondi never saw it coming. 1 minute, she was flipping through her case notes, expecting a routine hearing. The next, she was staring at a ruling so abrupt, so absolute, that for a brief second, even the air in the room felt heavier. Judge Malcolm Grayson didn't waste time. No pleasantries, no back and forth. Just a cold, measured statement that sent a ripple through the courtroom. The fine stands. No further discussion. That was it. Case closed before it even started. The city attorney beside her shifted, clearing his throat, but said nothing. The courtroom, usually buzzing with whispers, fell into an unnatural silence. Even the bailiff, a man who had seen thousands of hearings, barely moved. It wasn't just a ruling, it was a dismissal, a warning. Pam let the silence linger, tilting her head just slightly as if studying an opponent who had already overplayed his hand. Most people would have accepted the decision and moved on, paid the fine, walked out, forgotten the whole thing. Pam wasn't most people. She pressed her fingers lightly against the table, her voice steady, almost amused. "Your Honor, I believe we have yet to start." A shift, a flicker of something behind Grayson's cold stare. For the first time, the judge realized he had underestimated her. And that was his first mistake. Judge Malcolm Grayson wasn't the type to waste time. He ruled his courtroom with a sharp gaze and an iron grip, making it clear that challenges weren't welcome. His reputation preceded him. Efficient, unyielding, and uninterested in debate. Most attorneys knew better than to push back. Pam watched him carefully. He sat tall, shoulders squared, fingers tapping once on the bench before folding together. His expression gave nothing away, but his silence spoke volumes. He wasn't here to listen, he was here to decide. The fine stands. No arguments necessary. Just like that. No discussion, no evidence, no due process. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even the city attorney, who should have been celebrating the quick decision, shifted uncomfortably. He hadn't expected it to go this way either. Pam's eyes didn't waver. She had handled difficult judges before, but something about this felt different. Grayson wasn't just ruling, he was making a point. He wasn't looking at the facts, he was looking at her. A quiet statement wrapped in a judgment. Know your place. Pam adjusted her posture, her expression neutral. She wasn't one to react emotionally, but inside, her mind raced. There was no reason for this level of dismissal unless there was something more behind it. The courtroom was too quiet. Even the clerks, used to repetitive hearings, sat up a little straighter. The bailiff, hands clasped, watched the exchange with mild interest. Everyone sensed something was off, but no one spoke. Pam finally leaned forward, tapping her fingers against the table, controlled but deliberate. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I wasn't aware verdicts were issued before arguments were heard." The words hung in the air, a small, calculated challenge. Not disrespectful, not defiant, just enough to make him engage. Grayson's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker, the slightest narrowing of his eyes. "Miss Bondi, this court does not entertain frivolous defenses." Pam inhaled slowly, keeping her focus. Frivolous? He hadn't even given her a chance to present one. She glanced briefly at the city attorney, who looked away, wanting no part in what was unfolding. Pam folded her hands, voice steady. "If the defense was truly frivolous, Your Honor, it wouldn't require silencing before it begins." The gallery went still. Grayson's fingers twitched once before he leaned back. His silence said enough. He hadn't expected resistance. He had expected compliance. Pam knew the battle had just begun. "Then let's get this over with," he muttered. But his voice lacked the finality it had before. He wasn't in control of this case anymore. Not entirely. Pam didn't blink. She had dealt with stubborn judges before, but this was different. Judge Grayson wasn't just ruling against her. He was dismissing her outright, as if her argument wasn't worth the time. She exhaled slowly, keeping her posture steady. Every movement mattered now. The wrong reaction could cement his control, but the right response could shift the balance. "Your Honor, with all due respect, We haven't begun proceedings. Grayson barely looked up. There's nothing to proceed with. The matter is clear. A flicker of movement in the gallery. Attorneys exchanging glances. A clerk pausing mid-note. Everyone felt it. Cases didn't get shut down this fast. Pam tilted her head slightly, tapping a finger against the table, her voice even. If the law were that simple, we wouldn't need judges at all, would we? A slow silence spread through the room. Subtle but heavy. Grayson's grip on his gavel tightened just slightly. Miss Bondi, this court does not entertain baseless defenses. Pam flipped through the pages in front of her, not because she needed to. She already knew them by heart, but to make a point. She let the pause stretch just long enough before responding. Then it's fortunate I don't deal in baseless defenses. She looked up, her gaze sharp but composed. Before we move forward, let's clarify one thing. Are you saying this court enforces fines without due process? The judge hesitated, just for a second, and that was enough. Pam had been in enough courtrooms to know hesitation wasn't just a pause. It was a shift. It meant doubt. It meant he wasn't as certain as he wanted to appear. Grayson's voice was slower now. I am saying this violation is clear. The law is the law. Pam gave the smallest nod, as if she understood. And yet, Your Honor, there's a reason due process exists. Because when the law is applied selectively, it stops being law. It becomes power. A murmur, faint, but present. A few people in the back leaned forward slightly. Even the city attorney, who had been silent until now, shifted in his seat, as if realizing he might be part of something bigger than a simple fine. Pam didn't stop. If a fine can be imposed without evidence, without argument, then why have hearings at all? Why not let enforcement officers hand down penalties without judicial oversight? Grayson leaned back, his expression unreadable. Are you implying this court acts without fairness? Pam met his eyes. I'm asking if this court values precedent. She reached for a document, placing it neatly in front of her. Because last year, in Caldwell versus City of Tampa, a fine issued under similar circumstances was overturned on procedural grounds. The ruling stated that penalties cannot be upheld without an opportunity for legal argument. If this court decides otherwise, it contradicts established case law. The room tensed. Pam saw it before she heard it. A shift in Grayson's jaw, a flicker of irritation. He knew she was right, and now so did everyone else. He inhaled slowly, choosing his words carefully. The cases are not identical. Pam gave a slight shrug. But the principle is, either courts follow due process or they don't. So I ask again, Your Honor, are we enforcing fines based on legal grounds, or simply because it's easier? Silence. Grayson's fingers tapped once against the bench. Not impatient, calculating. She had forced him into a corner. He could stand firm and risk his ruling being overturned, or he could backtrack. Neither option made him look good. Pam kept her expression neutral, but inside, she knew this was far from over. Then let's get this over with, Grayson muttered, his voice carrying less certainty than before. He had planned to shut this down in minutes. Instead, she had just opened the floodgates. Pam didn't rush. She could feel the weight in the room shifting. Grayson had expected resistance, but not like this. She reached for a document in front of her, flipping a page with deliberate precision. Your Honor, if this fine is as unquestionable as you claim, then surely similar cases must have resulted in the same outcome? Grayson's eyes narrowed slightly, but he said nothing. Pam placed a legal brief on the table, her fingers pressing lightly against the edge. Last year, in Caldwell versus City of Tampa, a defendant was fined under nearly identical circumstances. The ruling? Overturned. Due process was ignored, just like today. The courtroom remained silent, all attention on the bench. Grayson exhaled slowly. The details of that case were different. Pam nodded as if she agreed. Of course, no two cases are exactly alike. But the principle remains the same. If the court ruled in favor of procedural fairness, then why wouldn't it now? Grayson didn't answer. Pam leaned slightly forward, her tone unwavering. I assume, Your Honor, that this court values consistency. After all, if rulings are applied selectively, then we stop following law and start enforcing opinions. A subtle shift. The words landed exactly where she wanted them to. The idea that justice could be arbitrary wasn't one a judge wanted attached to his name. Grayson's grip on his gavel tightened just slightly. That's not what's happening here. Pam turned another page in her folder, her voice calm. Then let's take a look at Grayson versus Hendricks. Your own ruling 2 years ago. She slid a document across the table, letting the implications sink in. Grayson's expression didn't change, but the way his fingers curled against the bench told her everything she needed to know. He remembered the case. Pam continued. In that decision, you stated that a fine issued without evidentiary support cannot be upheld in good faith. That was your ruling, Your Honor. Your words. The air in the room felt heavier now. The city attorney sat up straighter, flipping through his notes as if looking for an escape. The court stenographer barely moved, eyes sharp on her transcript. Pam let the silence stretch just long enough. Then she delivered the final push. So I ask again, Your Honor, does this court follow legal precedent, or does it ignore its own history when convenient? A beat passed. Grayson's jaw tightened, and for the first time, Pam saw it. Hesitation. He had walked into this hearing expecting compliance. Instead, he had just been cornered by his own words. Grayson didn't speak right away. His fingers drummed against the bench, his jaw locked tight. Pam could see the shift happening. He wasn't just annoyed. He was uncertain. And uncertainty in a judge was dangerous. Then, without warning, he reached for his gavel. This court will take a recess. A ripple of confusion passed through the room. Recess? Now? That wasn't normal, not for a case as simple as a fine dispute. The city attorney frowned but said nothing. The bailiff glanced toward the judge, waiting for further instruction. Pam sat perfectly still, but inside, she knew exactly what was happening. Grayson needed time. He wasn't ready to rule because she had forced him into a corner. And when a judge like him was backed against a wall, he didn't retreat, he called for backup. The courtroom emptied slowly, people whispering as they filed out. Pam remained in her seat, her hands folded over her legal pad. She didn't need to prepare. She already knew what was coming. They were about to change the rules. 15 minutes passed, then 20. When the doors opened again, the shift in atmosphere was immediate. Grayson re-entered, but he wasn't alone. Another figure walked in beside him, taller, older, carrying the kind of authority that came with decades on the bench. Judge Leonard Whitmore. Pam recognized him instantly. A senior judge, higher ranking than Grayson, known for stepping in when a case needed proper handling, which usually meant one thing: damage control. Whitmore took his seat, adjusting his robe as he surveyed the room. His expression remained neutral, but Pam knew better than to mistake that for impartiality. This wasn't routine. He was here for a reason. Grayson cleared his throat. Before we proceed, I have requested Judge Whitmore to sit in on this matter. Requested? Pam doubted that. Judges of Whitmore's level didn't drop by mid-hearing unless someone had pulled strings. Whitmore turned his attention to her. Miss Bondi, I understand you've raised concerns regarding due process in this case. Pam met his gaze without hesitation. That's correct, Your Honor. Whitmore nodded slowly, as if considering. And you believe this fine should be overturned based on state-level precedent? Pam's response was immediate. I don't believe it, Your Honor. I know it. A murmur rippled through the gallery. A few attorneys exchanged glances. Even the city attorney beside her tensed slightly, as if realizing the weight of her words. Whitmore leaned forward. I appreciate your confidence, but let's discuss specifics. You referenced Caldwell versus Tampa. Are you aware that a later ruling clarified that certain interpretations of that case could still allow enforcement under judicial discretion? Pam didn't flinch, so that was their play. Grayson had stepped back and brought in someone with more authority, hoping to twist a small technicality into a lifeline. She adjusted her posture slightly, keeping her voice even. I am aware of that ruling, Your Honor, But I also know that the same clarification stated that enforcement must adhere to strict evidentiary standards. Something that, in this case, was not done. Whitmore studied her, his expression unreadable. He expected her to back down, to waver under pressure. Instead, she had met his argument head-on. He exhaled quietly. Then let's talk about that. The enforcement officer who issued the fine is present in this courtroom. Would you like to cross-examine him? Pam kept her reaction neutral, but inside, she welcomed the opportunity. She hadn't expected them to introduce a witness, but if they were willing to put their case on display, she had no problem tearing it apart. Her gaze shifted toward the back of the courtroom as a man stood and stepped forward. Officer Brian Calloway, middle-aged, dressed in a crisp municipal uniform, walking with the confidence of someone who rarely had to justify his actions. Pam sat back slightly, her expression cool, her mind already forming the next move. They had just given her exactly what she needed. Pam didn't rush as Officer Brian Calloway took the stand. She watched him closely, noting the confidence in his stride, the casual way he adjusted his uniform. He wasn't nervous, yet. He took his oath, sat down, and folded his hands. Judge Whitmore gave him a nod. State your name and occupation for the record. Brian Calloway, Municipal Enforcement Officer. Pam stood, smoothing the edges of a document in front of her. Officer Calloway, can you confirm that you were the one who issued the violation in this case? He gave a firm nod. Yes, ma'am. Pam tilted her head slightly. And on what basis did you determine a violation had occurred? Calloway exhaled as if the answer was obvious. The property in question was not in compliance with municipal code. I observed the violation firsthand and issued the fine accordingly. Pam nodded slowly, glancing toward the judge's bench. Did you take any photographs of the alleged violation? A brief pause. No, ma'am, it wasn't necessary. Pam raised an eyebrow. No pictures? No video? Correct. A murmur spread through the back of the courtroom. Pam tapped her fingers lightly on the table, then continued. Did you collect any written statements from witnesses? Any independent verification? Calloway shifted slightly in his seat. That's not how these cases work. I have years of experience identifying these issues. My assessment was enough. Pam smiled just slightly. So, to be clear, you issued a fine based entirely on your personal judgment? Calloway hesitated, then nodded. Yes. Pam let the silence stretch. A few people in the gallery exchanged quiet glances. The city attorney straightened in his chair, looking suddenly uncomfortable. Then Pam turned back to Whitmore. Your Honor, I'd like to clarify something. Are we to understand that fines under this statute can be imposed without tangible evidence? That an officer's opinion alone is considered sufficient? Whitmore remained still, his face unreadable. Pam's voice was steady as she continued. Because if that's the case, then what prevents an officer from issuing fines arbitrarily? If no proof is required, what stops enforcement from acting on personal bias rather than documented fact? Calloway opened his mouth, but no words came out. Pam took a slow step forward. Officer, how many cases like this have you handled in the last year? Calloway cleared his throat. Hundreds. And in how many of those did you provide physical proof? Another pause. A longer one. Finally, he muttered, Not many. Pam turned to the bench. Your Honor, the law requires that penalties be based on evidence, not assumption. Without proof, this fine isn't just questionable. It's invalid. The room was silent. Judge Whitmore folded his hands. He knew she was right. Pam let the silence settle. No one dared to speak. The city attorney's eyes flickered toward the judge, but Grayson wasn't offering any help. She turned, her tone measured but firm. Counselor, if precedent is clear and there is no evidence to support this fine, how exactly does this court justify its enforcement? The city attorney swallowed, adjusting his tie. Your Honor, He stopped, realizing he had no argument. Pam didn't let up. Because as it stands, this ruling contradicts both state and appellate decisions. More importantly, it contradicts the basic principles of due process. Judge Whitmore sat back slightly, his gaze steady. Grayson, on the other hand, was gripping the bench, his fingers curling tighter. Pam turned to him directly. "Your Honor, let's be clear about what's happening here. A fine was issued without documentation, without verification, and without evidentiary support. This isn't enforcement. It's assumption." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Pam placed her hands flat on the table, her voice unwavering. "If we allow a ruling like this to stand, what message does that send? That laws are only as strong as the person enforcing them? That fines can be handed out on a whim?" She glanced toward the back of the courtroom. A few attorneys nodded subtly, understanding exactly what was at stake. Then she delivered the final strike. Or perhaps what we're really saying is that the law is flexible when convenient. That justice is negotiable. Grayson's jaw tightened. His silence spoke louder than words. Whitmore exhaled slowly. "Miss Bondi, you're making a serious claim." Pam didn't blink. "I'm making a factual one." The weight of her words settled over the room. She had left them with two choices: acknowledge the flaw or ignore it and risk setting a dangerous precedent. Neither option worked in their favor. The room was silent, heavy. Every eye was on Judge Grayson. He didn't speak right away. He sat there, shoulders stiff, fingers curled against the bench. Pam could see the conflict in his expression, pride fighting against reason. He exhaled sharply. "This court finds that the imposed fine does not meet the necessary evidentiary threshold. The fine is overturned." A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery. Some attorneys whispered to each other. Others simply watched, taking mental notes. Even the city attorney, who had sat through the entire hearing in uneasy silence, shifted in his chair, his expression unreadable. Pam didn't move right away. No celebration, no reaction, just a slow, steady nod. She had won, but she wasn't about to show satisfaction. That wasn't how this worked. Judge Whitmore remained still, his expression neutral. He had seen enough cases to know when a fight was lost. Grayson, on the other hand, looked like he had swallowed something bitter. He tapped his gavel against the bench. Court adjourned. Just like that, it was over. Pam gathered her papers, her movements unhurried. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on her. She had walked into this courtroom expecting a battle over a fine. Instead, she had exposed something far bigger, a system that relied on people not questioning authority. As she turned to leave, Grayson's voice stopped her. "Miss Bondi." She turned, meeting his gaze. He studied her for a moment before speaking. "I underestimated you." Pam gave a small, knowing smile. "You wouldn't be the first." Then she walked out, the echo of her footsteps the only sound in the quiet courtroom. She knew one thing: this wasn't just about a single case. The next time someone tried to issue a ruling without evidence, they would think twice. Because today she had set a precedent. Pam reached for her folder, stacking her papers neatly. The case was closed, but something told her this wasn't over. She could feel the weight of lingering stares as she turned toward the exit. Just as she stepped forward, a voice stopped her. "Miss Bondi," a moment. She turned to find Judge Whitmore watching her. Unlike Grayson, his face didn't show frustration, only measured curiosity. He wasn't a man who spoke without purpose. Pam met his gaze. "Yes, Your Honor?" He studied her for a beat before speaking. "You argued well today, but understand this: people in power don't forget when they're challenged." Pam held his stare, her expression unreadable. She had known this from the moment she first pushed back. "Noted," she said evenly. Whitmore gave the smallest nod, then turned, walking back toward the judge's chambers. Pam exhaled, adjusting her grip on her folder. She had won today, but victories like these came with consequences. As she stepped through the courtroom doors and into the bright hallway beyond, one thing was clear. This wasn't just about the law anymore. Now she was on their radar. Pam stepped into the sunlight, the courthouse doors closing behind her. The weight of what had happened still lingered, but she wasn't dwelling on the victory. This case wasn't just about a fine. It wasn't even about Judge Grayson. It was about something bigger: power, control, and the assumption that people won't fight back. She had proven that assumptions can be dangerous, that rulings can be challenged, that no one, no matter how high their position, is above being questioned. Power isn't about who holds the gavel, she thought. It's about knowing the law well enough to challenge it. She knew this wouldn't be the last time she faced a courtroom like that. It wouldn't be the last time someone tried to silence her before she even spoke. But now they knew her name, and next time they wouldn't underestimate her. Because the law isn't just about enforcement. It's about understanding. It's about standing firm when others expect you to fold. And most importantly, it's about never assuming that just because a judge hands you a ruling, you have to accept it. If you found this story compelling, let me know. Because in every courtroom, there's always more than meets the eye.